Hey guys, tonight we begin with a creature who shaped human history more than half the kings we've ever had, the dog. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Ice Age was not a magical snowy landscape where everyone learns about friendship. It was a frozen nightmare designed by nature's most sadistic intern. Temperatures tried to kill you. Predators tried to kill you. Even your own campfire sometimes tried to kill you by collapsing into your lap. Humanity survived out of stubbornness, bad decision-making, and the occasional lucky accident. One of those accidents began the greatest friendship in history. Imagine yourself wrapped in animal skins that smell like regret and mildew, sitting beside a fire that barely deserves to be called warm. Your entire clan looks like a group of exhausted raccoons wearing hats made of other raccoons. Dinner is a chunk of mammoth meat so burnt it qualifies as charcoal. Spirits are low. Hygiene is non-existent. Hope is a distant myth. Then you hear it. A low growl from the darkness. Not subtle, not friendly. The kind of growl that says, "I am considering eating you and your shoes." It's wolves, because of course it is. Wolves have been watching your camp all day, judging your hunting skills, which are terrible. They see you as a walking disappointment with a pulse. But tonight, something unusual happens. From the shadows steps the world's least successful wolf, a scrawny, socially awkward, bottom-of-the-pack reject. The kind of wolf who gets bullied by squirrels. He's starving, desperate, and clearly making bad life choices, like approaching humans who have spears and anxiety. He pads closer to the firelight. Humans panic internally. The wolf sits down like he owns the place. Everyone freezes. No one wants to be the first one eaten. The wolf looks at your mammoth bone with the same expression modern dogs use when you open a bag of chips. And then, in an act of ancient stupidity that changed the world, someone throws him a scrap. Not out of kindness, not out of hope, just, maybe if he eats this, he won't eat me. The wolf grabs the scrap, trots back into the darkness, tail twitching in what might be gratitude or indigestion. The next night he returns. And the next, and the next. Soon he's sitting closer, sleeping nearby, growling at other predators like he suddenly works security for the camp. Humans tolerate him because, honestly, life is easier when something with sharp teeth is on your side. Little by little, the killer becomes the freeloader. The freeloader becomes the companion, and the creature that once hunted us becomes the first ever dog. All because two species were too cold, too hungry, and too tired to kill each other. Once the world's least intimidating wolf realized humans were basically a walking buffet of half-cooked disappointment, he brought friends. Not the cool alpha wolves, no. Those wolves had standards. These were the outcasts, the weirdos, the wolves whose own mothers sighed at them. The kind of wolves who looked at their reflection in a frozen pond and thought, "I'm trying my best." These wolves discovered humanity's greatest invention long before fire, agriculture, or the wheel, the garbage pile. To Ice Age wolves, the human trash heap was like stumbling into a Michelin star restaurant where the chef is blindfolded and hates his job. Burnt bones, meat scraps, fat trimmings. Things humans threw away because even starving people said absolutely not. Wolves loved it. To them, it was gourmet. Soon enough, these wolves began hanging around the very edges of the camp, close enough to smell the stew, which smelled like sadness, but far enough to run if someone threw a rock. It was a relationship built on fear, caution, and an extremely low bar for good cuisine. Humans, for their part, realized something magical. The wolves that stayed were the ones that didn't immediately try to remove your leg. This was a valuable trait in the Ice Age. So the dynamic evolved. Wolves approached camp. Humans gripped their spears. Wolves made their best "I'm harmless and pathetic" face. Humans sighed, tossed a bone, and muttered about how this wasn't their job. Night after night, the wolves who were the least aggressive, or the most starving, returned. And slowly, these wolves changed. Not spiritually, not philosophically. Evolution simply said, let's make these things smaller, dumber, and more appealing to humans, who clearly love a fixer-upper. Snouts shortened, eyes widened, tail wagging accidentally evolved, likely from one wolf who got too excited about leftovers and discovered it earned more leftovers. Gradually, the wolves became less, "I might eat your children," and more, "I'm here for snacks and emotional support." But the wolves weren't doing charity. They got something out of this too. Warmth from human fires, protection from larger predators, a stable food supply, assuming humans caught anything that day. Occasional mammoth jerky, because desperation makes cooks generous. Evolution had done something extraordinary. It turned a deadly predator into the world's first professional trash eater, and humans, for once, felt slightly safer. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because a wolf with no ambition decided humans were easier to live with than other wolves. Welcome to the birth of domestication, the laziest yet most successful partnership in history. Domestication wasn't a magical moment where a wolf suddenly rolled over and said, "I think I'll be adorable now." No, it was thousands of years of slow, reluctant evolution, mostly driven by hunger, laziness, and the realization that biting humans was a bad career move. At this point, the wolves hanging around human camps weren't exactly wolves anymore. They were wolf-shaped disappointments. The runts, the socially anxious, the ones who couldn't hunt, couldn't fight, and probably failed basic wolf school. If wolves had student loans, these were the ones defaulting. But these were also the wolves who discovered something revolutionary. Acting slightly less murdery gets you free food. This was the dawn of survival through cuteness. A wolf with a slightly rounder face gets more leftovers. A wolf who doesn't growl at toddlers gets invited closer to the fire. A wolf whose tail wiggles instead of thrashing in rage gets awe noises, a sound that triggers the ancient human instinct to give away snacks. And so, generation after generation, these camp wolves changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but slowly, like a bad haircut growing out. Their skulls shrank, their teeth softened, their eyes widened into the expression scientists now classify as emotionally manipulative. Wolves became dogs the same way people become influencers, by performing harmless behavior until someone pays attention. Meanwhile, humans began to notice something else. These newly evolved proto-dogs didn't just stop attacking, they started helping. Kind of. One wolf might bark when a predator approached. Another might trail behind hunters, hoping for scraps and accidentally contributing to the hunt. A third might simply sit in camp, giving emotional support to someone who just lost a fight with a berry bush. Humans looked at these creatures, smaller than wolves, friendlier than wolves, and 10 times less competent than wolves, and thought, this one might survive if I protect it. So they did. The strong wolves died out. The cute, needy, clingy ones thrived. Evolution applauded this new strategy called being adorable, and thus the great transformation continued, from predator to scavenger, from scavenger to sidekick, from sidekick to creature that sleeps in your bed and steals half your pillow. The murder instinct faded. The feed me instinct intensified, and humanity found itself raising the world's first professional loaf-shaped companion. By the time proto-dogs had fully committed to the less murder, more mooching lifestyle, humans began to realize something shocking. These little ex-wolves were actually useful. Not very competent, not very coordinated, but useful in the way a loud, anxious roommate is useful. They might not help with chores, but they will certainly yell when something sketchy happens. Dogs became the world's first alarm systems, Picture a prehistoric night. The wind is howling, the fire is crackling, and your clan is trying to sleep through the sound of someone snoring like a dying mammoth. Suddenly, a rustle comes from the darkness. Before humans can reach their spears, one of the camp dogs erupts into frantic barking. Not brave, not heroic, just incredibly loud. Loud enough to wake the dead. Loud enough to make predators reconsider their life choices. This was revolutionary. Humans had invented nothing that could do this. The security system they had before dogs consisted of listening for trouble, hoping your ears worked. Crying dogs changed that. They barked at predators, strangers, shadows, suspicious rocks, their own tail. Basically, anything they decided was terrifying at the moment. And although prehistoric humans had many problems, sleep deprivation from dog barking was probably their first shared universal experience. But dogs weren't just noise machines. They were territorial. They adopted the camp as their domain. The same wolf who once considered humans trail mix with limbs now patrolled around the fire like an overworked bouncer. Humans appreciated this. They rewarded it with scraps, pets, pats, and constant enabling, the same dynamic that still exists between dogs and humans today. Soon, dogs discovered another superpower, tracking things better than humans ever could. They could smell predators before humans even sensed danger. They could tell the difference between harmless noises and something that actually wanted to eat you. And though dogs rarely fought predators directly, bravery was still a work in progress. They excelled at loudly announcing danger and then bravely hiding behind humans. And humans, for their part, began viewing these messy, needy, tail-wagging creatures not as wild animals, but as allies. Dogs weren't perfect. They still stole food. They still made bad choices. They still panicked at absolutely nothing. But for the first time in prehistory, humans had something watching their backs, something loyal, something protective, something that, occasionally, did the right thing on purpose. The Ice Age was still brutal. But now, humans didn't face the darkness alone. By now, early dogs weren't just scavengers or furry alarm clocks. They were becoming partners on the most miserable team sport in human history, Ice Age hunting. A sport where the rules were simple: catch something or starve. Preferably catch something that won't immediately catch you back. Humans were decent hunters, sure. They had spears, teamwork, and the ability to complain loudly about everything. But dogs? Dogs had superpowers. Noses that could detect prey from miles away, ears that twitched at the faintest snap of a twig, and energy levels that made humans seriously reconsider their own stamina. A typical hunt went something like this. Humans spot a herd of something large, angry, and equipped with horns capable of rearranging your skeletal system. Dogs notice it too, usually before humans, then start barking like unpaid interns desperate to impress their boss. The noise startles the prey, which either runs away or charges forward, depending on the animal's mood and sense of humour. The dogs sprint ahead, fueled by excitement, adrenaline, and absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. Humans follow behind, fueled by hunger, fear, and the knowledge that their winter coat is literally falling apart. Together, they form the world's first dysfunctional hunting party. Surprisingly, it works. Dogs chase prey into traps. Dogs flush animals from hiding spots. Dogs track wounded creatures through forests humans would get lost in instantly. Dogs do all the dangerous legwork, while humans show up at the end and throw spears like they contributed equally. And the best part? Dogs think this is fun. They have no concept of risk assessment. They don't understand fatal consequences. They're just thrilled to be involved in anything that isn't freezing to death or barking at a leaf. Of course, not every dog was a born hunter. Some dogs got distracted by butterflies. Some chased the wrong animal for 2 hours. Some ran off entirely and returned with a stick, proudly convinced they'd solved hunger forever. But humans tolerated all of this, because even the stupidest dog occasionally helped catch something edible. Ice Age hunting with dogs wasn't perfect, but it was better, faster, more successful, and most importantly, It bonded humans and dogs in shared triumph and shared trauma. There's nothing like being nearly trampled by a mammoth together to build trust. And slowly, humans began to realize these creatures weren't just useful. They were becoming essential. Partners, companions, something dangerously close to friends. Somewhere between barking at predators and chasing mammoths with questionable enthusiasm, dogs crossed a line, they moved in. Not in a formal, sign this lease agreement way, more in a, I'm cold, you're warm, and this arrangement benefits me more than you way. And humans, worn down by the Ice Age and poor decision-making, let it happen. Originally, dogs slept near the edges of campfires. Not too close. Humans smelled weird and made unpredictable noises in their sleep, but close enough to enjoy the heat. Then, one especially bold dog decided he was tired of frostbite and simply walked into a human shelter like he owned the place. Humans stared. The dog stared back. Then he curled up in the corner and acted like this was completely normal. And just like that, humanity lost the living room. At first, only a few dogs did this. The bravest, the dumbest, the ones who confused danger with opportunity. But soon enough, more followed. They realized humans had invented blankets. Primitive, smelly blankets, yes, but soft enough compared to sleeping on frozen dirt. Humans protested at first. They complained. They pushed the dogs away. And then, when the temperature dropped to, "Why are we alive?" they reluctantly pulled the dogs closer. Nothing warms a frigid shelter like a 50-pound fluffy space heater that occasionally snores. This was the moment everything changed. Dogs started treating human camps as their dens. They guarded them without being asked. They growled at strangers, barked at weird noises, and woke everyone up at 3 a.m. because a pine cone moved in a threatening way. Humans didn't realize it yet, but the domestication process was complete. The dogs weren't living with humans. The humans were living with dogs. Dogs claimed the warmest sleeping spots. Dogs ate the best scraps. Dogs inserted themselves into family matters like furry diplomats. Dogs decided who could approach the camp and who couldn't. Dogs even tried to help with chores, which mostly resulted in chaos, but was appreciated nonetheless. And the strangest part, humans didn't hate it. Despite the fur everywhere, the constant barking, the occasional stolen food, and the fact that dogs absolutely did not respect personal space, humans grew attached. Emotionally. Deeply. Because dogs did something no Ice Age human expected. They made life less miserable. The nights didn't feel so long. The cold felt less cruel. And for the first time in human history, someone greeted you with joy simply because you existed. The partnership was sealed. Not by blood, not by ritual, but by warmth, leftovers, and loneliness. As the Ice Age thawed and humanity collectively decided it preferred not dying of frostbite, civilization finally sprouted. And with it, dogs strutted right into the spotlight like they were auditioning for a historical documentary. And nowhere did they shine brighter than ancient Egypt, the land of gold, gods, pyramids, and an alarming enthusiasm for shaving things. Egyptians took one look at dogs and said, "Yes, this creature clearly has divine potential." Which is funny considering dogs were still rolling in questionable substances and eating whatever fell on the ground. But the Egyptians admired loyalty, courage, and a good set of teeth, qualities dogs had in abundance, unlike half the royal court. Dogs guarded homes, herded livestock, and accompanied hunters into marshes filled with hippos, crocodiles, and birds who looked like they held grudges. Egyptian hunters trusted their dogs more than their fellow nobles, and honestly, who could blame them? But Egypt took dog appreciation to new heights. Literally. They immortalized dogs in tomb paintings. They carved dogs into statues. They painted them on pottery. Some nobles even had their dogs buried beside them so they could continue peeing on sacred objects in the afterlife. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death, embalming, and please don't haunt me. Egyptians claimed he wasn't technically based on dogs. But let's be honest, ancient Egyptian jackals looked suspiciously like street dogs with eyeliner. The divine message was clear. Dogs were respected, feared, loved, and rumoured to work part-time guiding souls into the underworld. Despite all this worship, Egyptians also had a terrible habit. They shaved their dogs. Not for cleanliness or health reasons, but because bald dogs were considered fashionable. Imagine a majestic hunting dog, proud and skilled, suddenly shaved until it resembled a confused, shivering rat with existential questions. That was Egyptian style. Still, dogs in Egypt lived better lives than most peasants. They had names, they had collars, they had fan art. Some even had funerals more elaborate than your average taxpayer. If reincarnation is real, you definitely wanted to come back as an Egyptian noble's dog, not his servant. In Egypt, dogs were no longer just camp companions. They were symbols of protection, friendship, loyalty, and the universal truth. Dogs were already our best friends. Humans were just finally catching up. By the time dogs reached ancient Greece, they had survived the Ice Age, found religion in Egypt, and were now ready to deal with something far more stressful: Greek philosophers. Wolves had once faced mammoths. Dogs had once faced starvation. But nothing prepared them for a toga-wearing intellectual trying to explain ethics for 6 hours straight. In Greece, dogs were everywhere. In workshops, marketplaces, gymnasiums. Yes, Greeks exercised a lot. And most importantly, in philosophical schools. And if you're wondering what dogs were doing there, the answer is simple: sleeping through lectures. Dogs have always understood that the correct response to a man explaining the nature of truth is to take a nap. Yet the Greeks admired dogs. Deeply. They saw dogs as symbols of loyalty, bravery, and moral clarity. Everything the average Athenian citizen lacked. Greek warriors used dogs for protection. Farmers used them to guard flocks. Hunters used them to chase down prey. And philosophers used them as metaphors because apparently no discussion of virtue was complete without mentioning a good boy. But the funniest part? There was an entire philosophical movement named after dogs. The Cynics. The word cynic literally means dog-like. Not because they were loyal. No, because they lived simply, barked at society's nonsense, refused to follow rules, and occasionally peed in public to make a point. Dogs would have been proud. Socrates praised dogs for their ability to tell friend from enemy. Plato compared dogs to ideal guardians. Aristotle claimed dogs had a form of practical wisdom, which is ironic considering this was an era when dogs still ate rocks for fun. Meanwhile, Greek households adored their dogs and treated them surprisingly well. They gave them names like Foxy, Whitey, Growler, and Blitzer, proving that humans have always been bad at naming things. Dogs lounged in courtyards, begged for food in tavern entrances, and inserted themselves into family life with zero boundaries. But Greek dogs also had jobs. Real jobs. They guarded temples. They herded goats. They accompanied soldiers into battle, something Socrates politely declined to do. They even protected entire city gates at night, barking at suspicious noises and occasionally at absolutely nothing, continuing a proud tradition still practiced today. In the classical world, dogs weren't just companions. They were co-workers, bodyguards, sleep aids for bored philosophers, and furry symbols of everything humans wanted to be but rarely achieved. And the Greeks understood one thing better than anyone. Dogs live simply, love deeply, and judge silently, which makes them wiser than most philosophers. When dogs reached ancient Rome, they discovered something terrifying. An empire that tried to militarize absolutely everything. If Rome could weaponize it, it did. If it couldn't weaponize it, Rome conquered it anyway, and wrote a manual about why weaponizing it was a great idea. Naturally, dogs didn't escape this treatment. Romans looked at dogs, loyal, fast, and emotionally available, and said, "Yes, perfect, let's put armor on it." Enter the Roman war dog, an animal who did not sign up for this job. These dogs, often mastiffs or massive Molossian breeds, marched alongside legions, wearing spiked collars and occasionally chainmail. Imagine being a barbarian warrior, psyching yourself up for battle, only to see a huge armoured dog charging at you like the world's angriest kitchen appliance. Roman commanders loved these dogs. Not for their cuteness, that emotion was banned from the military, but for their ability to intimidate enemies and bite things on command. War dogs guarded camps, delivered messages, attacked intruders, and most importantly, stole food from soldiers who were already starving. A true multitasker. But it wasn't all war and violence. Romans also adored dogs at home. Wealthy families kept lapdogs with names like Fiddle, Little One, and Bitey. These tiny dogs slept on silk cushions, ate scraps from banquets, and definitely judged every guest who entered the villa. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers on the frontier shared their rations with giant shaggy dogs, who smelled like battle and potatoes. Roman farmers used dogs to guard livestock. Merchants used them to protect caravans. Even Roman priests used dogs during certain rituals, though the dogs probably had no idea why they were there and assumed it involved snacks. And of course, being Romans, they recorded everything. We have tombstones dedicated to beloved pets, complete with poetic inscriptions like, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my own hands." A level of emotion Romans rarely showed to actual humans, but the most ironic part, for all their glorification of war, conquest, and discipline, Rome still bowed, quietly, privately, to the emotional power of dogs. A dog could guard an empire. A dog could march with legions. A dog could serve in battle with courage no senator ever possessed. Yet at night, after the fighting, even the toughest Roman soldier rested easier with a dog curled at his feet. Because in Rome, as everywhere else, dogs weren't just warriors. They were family. As the Roman Empire puffed itself up across Europe, and the Greeks debated everything from ethics to the meaning of chairs, dogs were quietly doing something far more impressive, conquering the world without trying. No strategy, no legions, no diplomacy, just pause, charm, and zero understanding of borders. The moment humanity built the Silk Road, that long, dusty highway stretching from China to the Mediterranean, dogs looked at it and thought, "Nice, a walk." And off they went. Wherever merchants travelled, across deserts, mountains and cities, dogs followed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because a merchant dropped a dumpling, sometimes because a dog woke up from a nap and realised it was 600 miles from home and simply rolled with it. Caravans heading from China to Persia had the same three constants: camels complaining, merchants complaining louder dogs, who complained about nothing but still ate the most. Dogs became the Silk Road's unofficial employees. They guarded tents at night, chased thieves, and scared off animals that wanted to eat the merchandise. Traders learned one important truth: you can trust a dog more than a business partner. Different cultures began swapping more than silk and spices. They swapped breeds. A Persian trader might meet a Chinese caravan and see a fluffy little dog and think, "My wife will either love this or throw it at me." And suddenly, Pekingese were travelling across continents like tiny, grumpy diplomats. Meanwhile, hardy shepherd dogs from Central Asia moved westward, joining nomads and guarding livestock from wolves, who hadn't read the memo that dogs were now on Team Human. Every stop on the Silk Road added another chapter. In India, dogs found temples to guard and leftovers to steal. In Persia, they protected caravans and pretended to be noble. In Central Asia, they befriended horsemen with zero fear of death. In China, they became pampered palace pets who absolutely judged everyone. Dogs didn't just spread biologically, they spread culturally. People shared stories about them. Merchants traded them. Kings demanded them as gifts. Entire populations reshaped how they saw wolves because of dogs that wandered great empires sniffing everything in sight. By the time the Silk Road reached full swing, dogs had accomplished something extraordinary. They became the first global citizens, and they did it by following people who dropped crumbs. While humans mapped trade routes, built empires, and fought over territory. Dogs simply existed. And somehow, that was enough to take over the world. As civilization got richer, fatter, and more obsessed with showing off, dogs entered a new era, the status symbol era. This was when dogs stopped being just hunters, guards, or walking alarm systems. Now they were luxury items, fashion accessories, indicators of wealth, living proof that your social standing was so high you could afford a creature that did absolutely nothing. In wealthy Greek households, owning a fancy dog was the ancient equivalent of posting a picture of your sports car on Instagram. The more exotic the breed, the more people assumed you had a ridiculous amount of money and zero real problems. Aristocrats strutted through markets with elegant, fluffy dogs at their heels, while the dogs themselves looked constantly confused by their new environment. Why are there marble statues everywhere? Why is everyone yelling about democracy? But Rome took this concept to Olympic levels. Roman nobles kept toy dogs so tiny they could fit inside sleeves. Dogs that, evolutionarily speaking, had absolutely no business existing. These miniature, trembling creatures didn't hunt, didn't guard, didn't bark effectively. Their primary job was to sit on silk pillows and look judgmental. Many succeeded. Meanwhile, professional dog breeders emerged, creating dogs specifically for wealthy households. These breeders probably invented half of the modern dog problems we still deal with today. Overbred noses, fragile bones, and anxiety disorders inherited from 1,000 generations of palace gossip. It wasn't just small dogs, though. Wealthy elites loved massive dogs too. Enormous Molossian beasts that could guard estates, intimidate rivals, and accidentally crush your furniture. Owning one was the ancient version of saying, "I have power. Also, I may die if it sits on me." Dogs also started appearing in art. Every self-respecting noble wanted their portrait painted with a dog at their side, proof of sophistication, loyalty, and emotional depth. Although based on surviving sculptures, some nobles clearly loved their dogs more than their spouses. As empire after empire adopted dog culture, one thing became clear. Dogs weren't just animals anymore. They were social markers, political statements, symbols of taste, wealth, refinement, and occasionally, delusion. The dog who once hunted mammoths now lounged in marble villas eating roasted duck. The wolf who once survived by chasing deer now survived by being adorable enough to avoid banishment. And humanity didn't mind at all. Because nothing says, "I am wealthy and important," quite like a creature who contributes nothing and still gets treated like royalty. Welcome to medieval Europe, a place where the average peasant's life expectancy hovered somewhere between "don't get your hopes up" and "the plague is coming again." If you were poor, which was everyone except 3 people, your daily routine involved working from sunrise to please no more, eating bread that could break your teeth, and trying not to catch a disease that starts with a cough and ends with burial. In this chaos, dogs became indispensable, not as luxury ornaments, not as status symbols, but as actual survival equipment. The medieval peasant had 3 lines of defense against disaster: a wooden door that didn't close properly, prayer, and a dog that barked at absolutely everything. Medieval watchdogs were not the glamorous warriors of Roman legions. They were scruffy, muddy, vaguely potato-shaped creatures who smelled like compost and bad decisions. But they were loyal, alert, and always ready to sound the alarm, even if the danger was just a leaf blowing suspiciously. These dogs roamed village fences, guarded livestock, and escorted peasants home from long days in the fields. They weren't pampered, they weren't brushed. They certainly weren't fed high-quality medieval kibble. Their diet consisted largely of table scraps, stale bread, and things they found on the ground that no one talks about. Yet, medieval peasants adored them in their own way. A dog might sleep by the hearth, a generous word for pile of burning sticks, warm the children during winter, and chase off thieves desperate enough to rob someone who owned nothing. Dogs were essentially furry housemates who kept predators at bay: wolves, foxes, or the occasional drunk knight who fell asleep in the wrong cottage. But the partnership was mutual. Dogs got warmth, a human family, and a reliable food source, even if the food tasted like disappointment. They also got affection, not fancy collars or velvet cushions, but pats on the head and a life free from pack politics. Medieval dogs worked for a living. They herded sheep, they guarded granaries, they patrolled muddy roads with the seriousness of a knight defending his honour. Except knights usually smelled better. In the hierarchy of village life, peasants sat at the bottom. But dogs were somewhere just above peasants and below the local priest, and honestly they earned it. Because while medieval Europe battled plague, famine, taxes, raiders and more plague, these loyal animals stayed by humanity's side, barking their hopeless little barks into the darkness. And somehow, it helped. If medieval peasants had dogs for survival, medieval nobles had dogs for something far more dramatic: status, ego, and emotional support during political meltdowns. Dogs in castles lived a life so different from village dogs that you'd think they were entirely separate species. Peasant dogs slept on dirt floors. Noble dogs slept on cushions stuffed with goose feathers and the suffering of the lower classes. Castles were chaotic places. You had scheming nobles, bored knights, moody princes, and at least one suspiciously unhinged jester. Into this medieval soap opera entered the castle hound, massive, muscular, loyal, and usually better behaved than every human in the building. Nobles loved hunting, mostly because it gave them an excuse to avoid governing. Their hounds were essential for this. These dogs were trained to track boar, chase deer, and ignore the existential screams of peasants, watching their livestock vanish into the woods again. Castle hounds were serious professionals, unlike the nobles who owned them. Picture a hunting scene. A noble knight in a shiny helmet he can't see out of, a group of servants doing all the actual work, and a pack of hounds sprinting ahead thinking, "Finally, someone is letting us do our job instead of forcing us to sit through another banquet." These hounds were elite, strong, fast, loyal. They guarded castles, patrolled courtyards, and politely refrained from eating messengers, most of the time. Some castles even had entire rooms dedicated to dogs, warmer than the servants' quarters naturally. Meanwhile, noble ladies kept smaller dogs, delicate little creatures who spent their days on velvet cushions, receiving more affection than most husbands. These miniature dogs never hunted, never guarded, and never contributed anything except the occasional dramatic fainting spell. They were, in essence, medieval influences. Dogs in the noble world were also emotional anchors. Knights heading to war hugged their dogs. Lords confided in them. Queens fed them scraps under the table during political dinners, where everyone pretended to like each other. Dogs understood palace secrets better than the royal scribes, and they could keep them too. But the real comedy? No matter how fancy their surroundings, no matter how expensive their collars, castle dogs still behaved like dogs. They chased chickens, stole bread, barked at ghosts, and refused to come when called. Because even wrapped in luxury, a dog will always be a dog. And medieval nobles needed that kind of honest chaos more than they ever admitted. By the time Europe stumbled into the Renaissance, humans had rediscovered art, science, architecture, philosophy, and, most importantly, how to spoil dogs even more than the nobility already had. This was the age of genius. Michelangelo sculpted gods. Leonardo sketched helicopters. But Renaissance nobles, they invented something truly revolutionary: the extremely pampered lapdog. In Renaissance courts, dogs experienced the kind of glow-up usually reserved for reality TV contestants. These tiny velvet pillow creatures didn't descend from wolves so much as they descended from anxiety. They trembled constantly, demanded attention, and were carried everywhere because their legs were apparently decorative. Ladies of high society adored them. A noblewoman would glide through a palace wearing 40 pounds of silk, her hair stacked higher than her social expectations, and at her side sat a 4-pound dog that looked like it hadn't hunted anything larger than a crouton in its entire life. This dog ate better than 98% of the population, and contributed absolutely nothing beyond being cute enough to justify its existence. But the Renaissance wasn't all about tiny dogs. This was also a golden age for hunting breeds. Kings and dukes bred enormous, elegant hounds designed to sprint after deer at speeds that made knights seriously rethink their cardio routines. Hunting was no longer strictly practical. It was performance art. Men in tights chasing deer while dogs did all the real work. A Renaissance aesthetic. Meanwhile, artists became obsessed with painting dogs. Portraits of noble families almost always included a dog sitting proudly at their feet, looking more dignified than half the people in the room. In these paintings, dogs symbolized loyalty, virtue, and a reminder that someone in the household had actual emotional intelligence. And then there were the weird little spaniels who sat in ladies' laps during long carriage rides, balls, banquets, political negotiations, and marriages arranged by people who absolutely shouldn't have been in charge. These dogs served a crucial Renaissance function, keeping their owners from having a public meltdown. Royal courts were full of drama, betrayal, gossip, poisoning attempts, and fashion disasters. Having a tiny dog on your lap gave you at least one reason not to flip a banquet table. But whether tiny and fluffy or tall and regal, Renaissance dogs shared one unifying truth. They had successfully risen from Ice Age scavengers to elite members of the world's fanciest households, all without doing anything except being lovable and alive. After thousands of years of chaos, evolution, cultural drama, and truly questionable grooming choices, looking at you, ancient Egypt, we arrive at the end of our journey, where dogs officially solidify their position as humanity's first and best friend. Not by conquest, not by political treaties, but by simply being the most persistent freeloaders in history. Think about it. No other species has successfully infiltrated every era, every culture, every household, every couch. Dogs did what empires failed to do. Rome collapsed. Egypt fell. The Renaissance ended. Human trends came and went. But dogs just kept showing up, tail wagging, asking for snacks. By the late Renaissance, dogs had mastered humanity. They figured out the formula. Be cute, provide emotional support. Stare intensely while humans eat. Pretend to understand commands, profit. They evolved from wolves who hunted mammoths into creatures who now panic when their owner leaves the room for 30 seconds. They went from sleeping in snowdrifts to sleeping diagonally across an entire king-sized bed, forcing humans into uncomfortable L-shapes throughout the night. And here's the secret no historian likes to admit. Dogs didn't just become our best friends. They tricked us into becoming theirs. Think about the emotional manipulation. Dogs tilt their heads. Humans melt. Dogs whine softly. Humans hand over food. Dogs look sad for 0.5 seconds. Humans apologize for existing. Meanwhile, dogs give us unconditional love, loyalty, protection, companionship, and enough fur to knit an entire medieval cloak every week. They guard us, comfort us, and greet us with the enthusiasm of someone meeting a celebrity, even when we only went outside to get the mail. And yet, the strangest, most heartwarming truth is this. Dogs chose us. They weren't forced. They weren't captured. They weren't bribed with luxury. Okay, maybe a little bribed. But from the moment that first lonely wolf sat near that first lonely fire, dogs stayed because something about humans, our warmth, our chaos, our scraps, our stubbornness, felt right to them. And humans, battling ice, famine, empires, plague, heartbreak, and bad architecture, found something in dogs they couldn't find anywhere else. Pure, uncomplicated friendship. Not political, not philosophical, not strategic. Just real. And so the greatest partnership in history wasn't written in stone tablets or royal decrees. It was written in footprints, one human, one dog, walking side by side across the centuries. From Ice Age fires to Renaissance palaces to your living room today, dogs never stopped being our companions, and we never stopped needing them. Before the Roman legions ever set foot in Gaul, before Julius Caesar sharpened his quill to complain about everyone who wasn't Roman, there existed a group of figures who commanded more influence than any chieftain or warrior. These were the Druids, the cloaked scholars of the forest, the guardians of secrets, the philosophers who somehow managed to be both terrifying and charismatic at the same time. In a world where status usually came from how loudly you could shout or how many enemies you could decapitate, Druids stood apart. Their power came not from violence, but from something Gauls regarded with even greater awe: knowledge. To the ordinary Gaul, a Druid wasn't merely a priest. He was the astronomer who charted the stars, the judge who settled tribal disputes, the political advisor who reminded kings not to be idiots, and the mystic who could read divine signs in the smoke of a ritual fire. If your tribe needed to bless an upcoming battle, negotiate peace, resolve a property dispute, or figure out why your pigs were suddenly refusing to eat, you went straight to a Druid. Not because they were friendly, many were famously stern, but because everyone agreed they were the closest thing to a direct line to the gods. Their authority was built on an education system that would make even modern PhD students weep. A Druid might study for up to 20 years, memorizing colossal amounts of legal codes, genealogies, cosmology, poetry, mythology, ritual procedures, and philosophical doctrine. And they memorized all of it without writing anything down. Not because they lacked writing, they knew Greek and Latin well enough, but because they considered sacred knowledge too important to risk being read by people who weren't ready. Also, it's an excellent way to ensure that only the truly dedicated join your order. Nothing filters out the half-hearted like being told, "Wonderful, now memorize the entire spiritual history of your people by next winter." But perhaps the most intriguing part was their presence. A Druid didn't walk. He arrived. Wrapped in woolen robes, usually white for rituals, they carried an aura of seriousness that even the rowdiest warriors respected. Kings listened to them. Entire tribes deferred to them. And when a Druid raised his hand to speak, the forest seemed to go quiet, as if the very land acknowledged their authority. They were scholars, mystics, scientists, judges, and philosophers, all wrapped in one enigmatic figure whose power flowed not from a throne, but from the depths of ancient memory. If Chapter 1 introduced the Druids as the quiet power behind Gaulish society, Chapter 2 reveals the training grounds that forged these forest philosophers, the sacred groves. These weren't your ordinary patches of trees. To the Celts, a grove wasn't just a location, it was a living classroom, a sanctuary where knowledge flowed as freely as the wind through oak leaves. And for aspiring Druids, it was where their minds were reshaped, reorganized, and occasionally broken by the sheer amount of information they were expected to memorize. Entering Druidic training was a commitment far more intense than joining a warrior band. Warriors trained to fight. Druids trained to understand everything: the stars, the laws, the gods, the seasons, medicinal herbs, moral philosophy, sacred geometry, and a terrifying amount of poetry. Their curriculum was equal parts academic, spiritual, and brutally practical. Students might spend years observing the sky to track seasonal cycles, studying the behavior of animals to interpret omens, or learning which plants cured ailments and which plants made you see glowing spirits dancing on riverbanks. But the core of their training, and the part Romans found most suspicious, was their absolute refusal to write any of this knowledge down. To the Druids, writing things was like handing out cheat codes to the universe. Sacred knowledge needed to be earned, not skimmed. As a result, memory became their most powerful tool. A Druid in training had to memorize vast oral libraries, some lasting hours or even days when recited properly. If you forgot a section, you didn't get a gentle reminder. You started again, from the beginning, often while standing in cold fog, because Gaulish weather does not care that you're trying to become a priest. Their teachers were strict but respected. Senior Druids were the custodians of cultural memory, and they enforced discipline not through punishment, but through expectation. They saw themselves as guardians of civilization, and if you wanted to join them, You had better treat that responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. Yet their education wasn't just about storing information. It was about shaping a mind capable of interpreting the world. A druid needed to read signs in nature, understand the cycles of the cosmos, make legal judgments, advise kings, and perform rituals. Their knowledge wasn't theoretical. It had weight, consequences, and meaning. By the end of their training, a successful student emerged not just as a scholar, but as a conduit between the human world and the realm of the divine, a role only a few were ever truly prepared to carry. To outsiders, the Druids looked like mysterious forest mystics. But to the Gauls themselves, Druids were something far more practical. They were the backbone of justice. Long before Roman law marched across Europe wrapped in togas and bureaucracy, the Druids served as the judges and arbitrators of Celtic society. If someone stole cattle, broke an oath, insulted a clan, or accidentally set fire to their neighbour's hut, because open flames and thatched roofs are a terrible combination, it was the Druids who stepped in to decide the matter. Their authority as judges wasn't symbolic, it was absolute. When a Druid delivered a verdict, the tribe obeyed. Even kings had to swallow their pride and accept the decision, because defying a Druid wasn't merely illegal, it was unthinkable. The Druids carried the weight of tradition, divine authority, and centuries of precedent in their words. And unlike Roman courts, where some clever orator could twist laws like pretzels, Celtic justice relied on memory and consensus. A Druid didn't consult scrolls. He consulted centuries of oral tradition stored in his mind. Druidic law wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoring balance. Their rulings focused on compensation, reconciliation, and preventing needless blood feuds. In a world where personal honor mattered as much as survival, these judgments held communities together. A single feud between families could spiral into years of chaos, and the Druids acted as the brakes on that cultural catastrophe. They negotiated peace between clans, divided land, and resolved disputes in a way that preserved social harmony. They also oversaw oaths, treaties, and diplomatic agreements. When two tribes agreed to peace, a Druid witnessed the pact, invoking the gods as guarantors. Breaking a promise in the presence of a Druid was the ancient Gaulish equivalent of painting a massive target on your back. Not because the Druid would punish you directly, but because the gods supposedly would. The Romans found this legal power unsettling. Caesar complained that Druids could even forbid people from participating in rituals or gatherings, effectively exiling them spiritually. In a society built on communal identity, this was the harshest punishment imaginable. A social death sentence delivered without raising a sword. Through their judgments, the Druids shaped everyday life in Gaul. They weren't simply wise old counsellors. They were the living embodiment of law and order, holding the delicate fabric of tribal society together with memory, diplomacy, and a reputation so respected that even warriors feared disappointing them. If the Druids were the judges and philosophers of Gaul, they were also its ritual specialists, the ones who kept the spiritual machinery of the Celtic world running smoothly. To the Gauls, every river, hill, grove, and storm had a spirit. The universe was alive, and the Druids were the only ones who knew how to communicate with it properly. Their ritual responsibilities ranged from the gentle, seasonal blessings, healing ceremonies, to the dramatic, interpreting omens in sacred fires, to the slightly terrifying, depending on which Roman author you believe. Central to Druidic ritual life was the sacred calendar. The Druids charted the turning of the seasons, the cycles of the moon, solstices, equinoxes, and the invisible rhythms that shaped agricultural and spiritual life. Festivals such as Samhain, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Imbolc weren't random celebrations. They were precise markers in a cosmic schedule. A festival performed too early or too late risked disturbing the harmony between the human world and the divine. So yes, if a Druid showed up and told you the bonfire must be lit now, you lit it. Immediately. Their rituals involved offerings to the gods, often food, crafted objects, or animals, though the Romans famously accused Druids of performing human sacrifices. Caesar described wicker effigies filled with victims and set ablaze, a scene dramatic enough to make any Roman reader gasp. Whether these accounts were accurate, exaggerated, or propaganda meant to justify conquest is still debated. But one thing is clear: the Druids were deeply connected to ritual acts meant to restore balance, heal dishonour, or ensure divine favour. What Rome saw as brutality may have been, to the Gauls, a sacred duty carried out in times of crisis. Druids also oversaw augury, reading signs from nature. The movement of birds, the crackle of fire, the shapes formed by smoke. All were messages from the gods. A druid trained for decades could interpret these signs like a cosmic language. Warriors wouldn't go to battle without their blessing. Farmers wouldn't plant without their timing. Even kings sought ritual confirmation before making major decisions. But what truly set Druidic rituals apart was their setting. Rather than temples carved from stone, the Druids preferred natural sanctuaries, oak groves, riversides, hilltops, places where the boundary between worlds felt unusually thin. Here, under ancient branches or open sky, they performed acts meant to maintain harmony between the mortal and the divine. In these groves, surrounded by the living world, the Druids became not just priests, but caretakers of cosmic balance, guiding Gaul through the unseen forces that shaped its destiny. While the Druids are often remembered as forest mystics whispering secrets beneath ancient oaks, their minds were equally fixed on the sky above. To the Gauls, the cosmos wasn't an abstract concept. It was a living clock, a divine script written in constellations, cycles, and shadows. And the Druids were the ones who learned how to read it. Far from being primitive priests, they were highly skilled astronomers who charted the heavens with a precision that astonished even the Romans. Long before telescopes or observatories, the Druids used the natural world as their laboratory. Hilltops, stone circles, rivers reflecting moonlight. These became tools for measuring the passing of time. Through patient observation, they learned to predict solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, and seasonal shifts. Their knowledge of lunar cycles was so refined that Caesar himself admitted, somewhat begrudgingly, that the Druids had mastered the calculations needed to maintain a lunar-based calendar. This celestial knowledge wasn't just intellectual, it shaped everyday life. Agriculture depended on the right timing. Rituals demanded precise astronomical alignment. Festivals had to occur during the correct cosmic window. A druid might travel across territories simply to ensure that a sacred fire was lit at the moment the sun crossed a specific threshold. If that meant climbing a windy hill at dawn while wrapped in layers of wool, so be it. Cosmic schedules are notoriously unforgiving. But perhaps the most striking evidence of Druidic astronomy lies in the monuments scattered across Celtic lands. Though some predate the Druids by millennia, the Druids inherited them and used them as astronomical instruments. Stone circles, standing stones, and megalithic complexes often align with solstices or lunar events, suggesting that the Druids understood the Earth-sky relationship better than most ancient cultures. In these stone landscapes, the Druids acted as both astronomers and historians, preserving ancient knowledge and integrating it into their teachings. Their interest in the stars wasn't merely scientific, it was philosophical. To the Druids, the universe was a harmonious system. Everything had a rhythm, a place, a purpose. Understanding the heavens was a way of understanding the will of the divine. Their cosmology connected human fate with celestial order, suggesting that the world operated according to principles that could be learned through observation and wisdom. Because of this, Druidic astronomy carried enormous authority. If a Druid declared that the gods favoured or forbade an action based on cosmic readings, no warrior, king, or council dared defy it. Their grasp of the stars elevated them from priests to cosmic interpreters, figures capable of bridging earthly life with the vast, mysterious expanse above. If the Druids looked to the stars to understand the heavens, they also looked down, to the earth, the roots, the bark, the moss, the water, to understand the body. In a world without formal doctors, where most medical treatments involved either prayer or pure hope, The Druids were the closest thing Gaul had to trained physicians. Their healing practices were not random folk remedies. They formed a sophisticated system woven from observation, ritual, and generations of cumulative knowledge. Druidic healers were masters of herbal medicine. They knew which plants numbed pain, which reduced fevers, which healed wounds, and which you should absolutely not touch unless you intended to spend the next 6 hours hallucinating that the river was speaking to you. Their botanical wisdom was legendary. They harvested mistletoe from sacred oaks with golden sickles, not because it looked dramatic, but because they believed it carried divine vitality. They used willow bark, rich in salicin, the precursor to modern aspirin, long before chemistry gave it a proper name, but their healing went beyond herbs. Druids understood the importance of environment, diet, and ritual cleansing. They used steam baths, river immersion, and even forms of massage. They treated not just the physical wound, but the spiritual imbalance believed to cause it. To a Gaul, illness wasn't simply biological, it was a disruption in the harmony between body, spirit, and the world of the gods. The Druids' job was to restore that balance. Their reputation also included more mysterious practices. They interpreted dreams, analysed physical signs, and used chants believed to activate the healing properties of certain herbs. While modern medicine would roll its eyes at the idea of singing to a poultice, the Gauls believed the spoken word carried power, and the Druids were the most skilled wielders of sacred speech. Knowledge of poisons was also part of their repertoire. Druids understood toxic plants as well as medicinal ones, which made them invaluable in identifying dangers and, if necessary, in crafting substances for warfare or ritual. This, unsurprisingly, made the Romans deeply suspicious. To Caesar, a priest who could cure a fever one day and brew a lethal extract the next was a political threat wrapped in robes and botanical expertise. Yet, at their core, Druidic healers were caregivers. People sought them out in moments of vulnerability, childbirth, injury, fever, emotional turmoil. Their role wasn't only to stitch wounds or cure sickness, but to reassure, guide, and reweave the invisible threads that tied individuals to the greater cosmic order. In this way, Druids stood not only as guardians of the mind and spirit, but also as protectors of the fragile human body, bridging earth, plant, and soul in the delicate art of healing. While warriors roared on the battlefield and kings boasted of their lineage, the true political nerve centre of ancient Gaul often rested quietly in the hands of the Druids. They did not wear crowns or command armies, yet their influence shaped decisions at every level of society. Where others wielded spears, the Druids wielded counsel, and in many ways, that was the deadlier weapon. Kings could rule tribes, but Druids ruled hearts, minds, and the invisible fabric of legitimacy. In a world of shifting alliances and intertribal rivalries, the Druids acted as the diplomatic glue holding everything together. When two clans were embroiled in a feud stretching back generations, perhaps triggered by cattle theft, insult, or someone's very unfortunate choice of words, it was the Druids who stepped in to negotiate peace. Their authority transcended tribal boundaries. A Druid from one region could mediate disputes hundreds of miles away because their reputation travelled farther than any warrior's spear. Kings trusted them, or perhaps a better phrase would be, kings depended on them. Political decisions required divine approval, and Druids were the interpreters of divine will. Before declaring war, making alliances, or launching major expeditions, rulers consulted their Druids. A wise king listened, a foolish king didn't, and usually regretted it. If a Druid declared that the omens were unfavourable, even the most eager warrior would sheathe his sword and wait. But Druidic influence didn't stop at diplomacy. They also served as national memory keepers. They preserved genealogies and histories, ensuring that rulers could trace their lineage back to heroic ancestors. Without Druidic validation, a king's claim to authority could crumble. It was one thing to boast. It was another to have the intellectual elite confirm your ancestry in front of an entire tribe. This, unsurprisingly, terrified the Romans. Caesar realized that while he could defeat Gaulish warriors through military force, he couldn't fully conquer the population as long as the Druids remained politically active. They unified tribes, stirred resistance, and embodied the spiritual backbone of the land. Eliminating Druidic influence became as crucial as defeating any Gaulish chieftain. Yet despite their power, Druids rarely sought personal glory. They did not strive to rule, they strove to guide. Their authority came not from position, but from wisdom, memory, and the trust of the people. They were the steady presence behind shifting political landscapes, the quiet shadow behind every throne, ensuring that rulers governed not through impulse, but through cosmic order and ancestral law. In this role, the Druids shaped Gaul not with swords, but with wisdom, and in doing so, controlled a power deeper and more enduring than any battlefield victory. By the time Rome's eagle standards appeared on the horizon, the Druids were already deeply entrenched as the intellectual and spiritual core of Gaul. To Julius Caesar, this was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. Conquering a land physically is one thing, conquering the minds and beliefs of its people is another. And the Druids were precisely the kind of leaders who could inspire a population to resist an empire. They had no swords, no armies, and no fortresses, but they possessed influence, authority, and a network of loyal students spread across tribes. To Rome, that combination was far more threatening than any warrior. Caesar's own writings, which, let's be honest, are as neutral as a politician's autobiography, paint a dramatic picture of Druids stirring resistance. He describes them as organizers of rebellion, custodians of anti-Roman sentiment, and the spiritual engineers behind uprisings like those of Vercingetorix. Though Caesar blamed them for virtually everything, the truth is simple. The Druids represented a cultural identity Rome couldn't absorb. Where Rome brought laws, taxes, and infrastructure, the Druids embodied memory, tradition, and a worldview incompatible with imperial control. The Romans understood that defeating warriors only won battles. Defeating the Druids would win Gaul. As the conquest unfolded, Druids became targets. Sacred groves were cut down, ritual sites desecrated, and Druidic assemblies banned. Rome hoped that by destroying the places where Druids performed rituals, they could sever the spiritual roots of Gaulish identity. Yet the Druids persisted. They didn't vanish. They adapted. Some retreated deeper into forests, continuing their teachings in secrecy. Others travelled to regions still free from Roman rule, such as Britain and Ireland, strengthening resistance networks. The island sanctuary of Anglesey became a last stronghold, a place where Druids gathered in numbers. When the Roman general Suetonius Paulinus arrived in 60 CE to crush it, he encountered something chilling even for hardened soldiers. Druids lining the shore, chanting curses, women in black garments screaming prophecies, fires burning behind them like the backdrop of an apocalyptic scene. Even disciplined Roman soldiers hesitated, but eventually Rome attacked, slaughtering Druids and torching the sacred groves. This moment marked the symbolic destruction of Druidic power in Gaul, but even then, Rome could not erase the memory of the Druids. Their teachings continued underground, woven into folklore and oral tradition. Conquered they may have been, but extinguished they were not. The war for the soul of Gaul did not end with swords. It simply moved into memory. When Rome finally tightened its grip on Gaul, and the last sacred groves fell silent beneath the axes of legionaries, many assumed the Druids would fade into the footnotes of history. Another conquered priesthood absorbed into the empire. But the Druids refused to disappear. Their legacy, persistent and subtle, flowed through the centuries like an underground river, resurfacing in unexpected places, shaping memory long after their physical presence was erased. The most enduring part of their legacy lies in the lands Rome never fully conquered, Ireland and parts of Britain. There, Druidic traditions survived, evolving into the early Celtic Christian monastic systems. Many of the monks who later illuminated manuscripts, preserved ancient lore, and built monastic schools, inherited intellectual habits remarkably similar to those of the Druids. Memorization, oral teaching, reverence for nature, scholarship rooted in observation rather than dogma. Even the idea of sacred knowledge carefully guarded and taught through long apprenticeship echoes Druidic methods. Folklore, too, kept the Druids alive. Generations of storytellers whispered about wise men in white robes, about healers who spoke with rivers, about judges whose words carried divine weight. The stories changed over time, of course. Medieval writers turned them into wizards. Renaissance thinkers romanticized them as natural philosophers, and modern pop culture made them staff-wielding magicians with suspiciously good hair. But beneath every retelling lies a real cultural memory, the respect and mystery that surrounded the ancient Gaulish Druids. Their reverence for nature also survived in countless practices. The idea of sacred groves influenced early Christian holy sites. Many churches were built near ancient ritual trees or springs, as if acknowledging that the land itself still held memory. Even today, Celtic festivals like Samhain and Beltane, though reshaped over time, trace their roots back to calendars the Druids helped maintain. Their intellectual legacy is equally profound. The Druids believed the universe was a harmonious, interconnected system, a philosophy remarkably close to modern ecological thought. They saw humanity as woven into the natural world, not above it. This worldview, once dismissed as primitive, now feels uncannily ahead of its time. And perhaps most importantly, the Druids remain symbols of wisdom, resistance, and identity. They embody the idea that knowledge can be a form of power more enduring than swords or empires. Rome conquered Gaul, yet the Druids persist in memory, myth, and cultural consciousness. Their groves may have fallen, but their echoes still linger, in stories, in traditions, and in the ancient sense that wisdom is something grown, guarded, and passed on under the whispering branches of time. Harald Sigurdsson did not enter history quietly. At just 15 years old, an age when most boys are still figuring out how not to trip over their own feet, Harald found himself standing in the middle of a battlefield that would change the course of his life. The Battle of Stiklestad was chaos incarnate, steel flashing in the Nordic sun, shields splintering, war cries echoing through the valley. And at its bloody centre, Harald watched his half-brother, Olaf the Stout, fall beneath a storm of blades. Norway's king was dead, the rebellion crushed, and Harald suddenly realized he was now on the losing side of absolutely everything. In the aftermath, the young warrior did the only sensible thing. He ran. Not because he lacked courage, but because even the bravest men know that facing an angry faction of victorious Norwegian farmers with nothing but teenage optimism is a poor strategy. With a handful of loyal companions, Harald slipped into the forests, then east across the mountains, leaving behind a kingdom he could no longer call home. But exile did not break him. If anything, it sharpened him. He reached the court of Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, where the tall, intense Norwegian quickly distinguished himself. Yaroslav saw promise in the towering teenager who carried himself like a man twice his age, and for Harald, this was only the beginning. He spent months forging alliances, training with hardened warriors of the Rus, and letting the embers of ambition grow hotter within him. Yet Harald's gaze was set even farther, toward the shimmering jewel of the medieval world, Constantinople, the city of emperors, gold, secrets, and dangers. To Norsemen it was known as Miklagard, the great city, a place where fortunes could be made, or lives lost in a heartbeat. And Harald, still barely out of boyhood, decided that was where he belonged. When he finally arrived, towering over most Byzantines by a full head, the guards at the city gates probably wondered which northern saga had accidentally walked into their shift. The Byzantines would soon learn his name. He would join the elite Varangian guard, rise through its ranks with startling speed, and build a reputation so fierce that whispers of him would travel back to the fjords he had fled. He left Norway as an exile, but in Byzantium, Harald Hardrada would begin his transformation, from runaway prince to legend. By the time Harald finally stood before the gates of Constantinople, he had crossed more rivers, forests, and hostile territories than most people do in a lifetime. But nothing, not even the glittering courts of Kiev, prepared him for Miklagard. Its marble walls towered like cliffs. Its markets buzzed with 1,000 languages. Its palaces gleamed with gold, mosaics, and enough luxury to make even a jaded Viking rub his eyes. To Harald, who had grown up in a wooden hall surrounded by goats and snow, this was another planet. And yet, he did not shrink. He walked through Constantinople as though he were returning from a long journey rather than entering the greatest empire on earth. His height alone drew stares. Norse sagas insist Harald was so tall that most Byzantine soldiers looked like children beside him. Whether this was truth or heroic exaggeration hardly mattered. The Varangian Guard, the Emperor's elite Scandinavian corps, noticed him immediately. Joining the Varangians wasn't simple. They weren't a place for common drifters or drunken adventurers hoping for a paycheck. This was a regiment built on loyalty, discipline, and an unspoken oath: protect the Emperor at any cost. The Byzantines trusted the Norse because they were foreign, meaning they had no local political loyalties. They were warriors hired for their strength and their stubborn inability to be bribed. If you wanted an honest sword, you bought a Varangian. Harald approached their commanders with confidence, offering not humble petition, but a resume of hard-won experience. He had survived a lost war, fought beside seasoned Rus warriors, and carried himself like someone destined to command. The Varangians accepted him, and so Harald Sigurdsson, runaway Prince of Norway, became a member of the Emperor's personal guard. Training began immediately. The Varangians drilled in complex formations, learned Byzantine military etiquette, and studied tactics that would have appeared almost magical to northern warriors accustomed to brute force combat. Harald adapted quickly. His discipline impressed the officers, and his sheer physical presence made him a natural in the shield line. To the Byzantines, he was exactly the sort of man you wanted standing in the palace corridor when someone whispered the words, "assassination plot." But Harald was more than muscle. He studied languages, court politics, and Byzantine strategy. He watched the empire carefully, absorbing its secrets and ambitions like a sponge. He had come seeking fortune, but he found something far more potent: a path to power, a stage worthy of his legend, a forge that would transform a wandering exile into the thunderbolt of Byzantium. Life in the Varangian Guard was nothing like Harald's past as a Norwegian prince or a wandering exile. The Guard was an institution built on iron discipline, relentless training, and absolute loyalty to one man, the Byzantine Emperor. For Harald, this was a world of shining armour, marble halls, and complex politics, very different from the wooden halls and direct sword-to-the-face diplomacy of the North. Yet he adapted with astonishing ease, as though he had been waiting for an environment worthy of his ambition. New Varangians quickly learned the rules: speak little, watch everything, and never, ever betray the Emperor. Their duties included guarding palace gates, patrolling corridors lined with gold mosaics, and standing silent vigil during imperial ceremonies that seemed to last longer than some Viking winters. And though it might sound ceremonial, danger lurked everywhere. Byzantine court politics made northern feuds look like children arguing over toys. Plots simmered constantly, and the threat of assassination was as normal as morning prayers. This environment sharpened Harald. He learned to read subtle gestures, sense tensions in a room, and recognize the quiet signs of treachery. His intelligence impressed senior officers, and his height made him an almost mythical presence in the Emperor's entourage. When Harald stood behind the throne, axe in hand, everyone understood the message. Loyalty had a very large, very sharp guardian. The Varangians drilled endlessly. They practiced formation combat, shield wall tactics adapted to palace defense, and emergency evacuation procedures for the Emperor. For Harald, who had grown up in a culture that glorified individual valor, Byzantine discipline was a revelation. Here he learned strategy, coordination, and the fine art of staying alive in the deadliest political battleground in Europe. His determination did not go unnoticed. Emperor Michael IV himself reportedly took interest in the tall northern warrior. Harald's skill, unwavering focus, and silent professionalism made him stand out in a corps already filled with elite fighters. If the emperor walked at night, Harald might be among the guards at his side. If a ceremony required absolute security, Harald might be stationed closest to the dais. Bit by bit, he earned a place in the empire's inner protective circle. For a young man who had lost his homeland, this was more than honor. It was validation, a sign that he could rise again, rebuild his future, and forge a name greater than anything Norway might have offered him. The exile was no more. The ascent of Harald Hardrada had begun. Serving in the Varangian Guard was not a matter of lounging in palace corridors all day, polishing axes and looking intimidating, though Harald excelled at that part too. Byzantium was an empire constantly under pressure. Rebellions flared like brush fires across its vast provinces. Bulgarian uprisings, Sicilian revolts, Anatolian conspiracies, and the endless turbulence in the east. And when things grew dangerous enough that ordinary Byzantine troops hesitated, imperial commanders summoned the Varangians. They were the emperor's fire brigade, sent to extinguish trouble with cold steel and northern determination. Harald, still young, but driven by a need to prove himself, threw his entire being into these campaigns. The sagas describe him fighting in Bulgaria, Sicily, Asia Minor, and even as far as the Holy Land. Wherever a rebellion surged, Harald appeared like an axe-wielding omen. His preferred tactics, according to later Norse tradition, involved hitting enemies so hard and so fast they questioned their life choices before they even hit the ground. The Byzantines learned very quickly. If you wanted a problem solved permanently, you sent the tall Norseman with the intense eyes and the unnervingly calm expression. One of his most famous campaigns was in Bulgaria, where the rebellion was so fierce that Byzantine soldiers had begun calling the uprising the War of the Mountains. The terrain was brutal, dense forests, rocky passes, ambushes at every turn. But Harald thrived in conditions others feared. The Varangians pressed relentlessly into rebel strongholds, carving through difficult terrain with the stubbornness only a Norse warrior could maintain. The sagas claim Harald was the first to storm walls, the last to retreat, and occasionally the one who suggested strategies bold enough to make Byzantine officers blink twice. His reputation grew with every campaign. Rebels whispered about the Northman giant. Byzantine commanders began relying on him not just as muscle, but as a dependable problem solver. And Emperor Michael IV reportedly rewarded him personally for his role in crushing uprisings, gold, rank, and trust. But it wasn't only battlefield ferocity that earned Harald respect. It was his discipline. Even when fighting far beyond the capital, he remained unwaveringly loyal to the emperor. While other mercenaries bent with political winds, Harald stayed steady, a trait Byzantines cherished in a world where betrayal was a seasonal event. Every rebellion he crushed, every fortress he helped take, elevated him higher. Harald was no longer merely a guard. He was becoming Byzantium's thunderbolt, the warrior the empire unleashed when failure was not an option. And with each victory, the legend of Harald Hardrada burned brighter. By the time the rebellions had been stamped out and the empire's borders momentarily quieted, Harald Hardrada was no longer just another Varangian with a heavy axe and a talent for surviving impossible situations. He had become something far rarer, a warrior the emperor himself trusted. Emperor Michael IV, a man surrounded by intrigue, sycophants, and enemies disguised as friends, needed absolute loyalty, and found it in the towering Norwegian exile who never flinched, never hesitated, and never bent. Harald's promotion into the emperor's personal bodyguard marked a new chapter in his life. The palace, with its marble corridors, jeweled icons, and oppressive political tension, became his battleground. He learned the rhythm of imperial life, the early morning audiences, the ceaseless petitions, the quiet whispers exchanged behind veils and curtains. Here, a single, misplaced step could be deadlier than any sword stroke. Harald became a silent sentinel, watching everything with the unblinking focus of a wolf guarding its den. The sagas claim he stood at Michael's side during ceremonies, banquets, and private meetings. When the emperor travelled, whether by ceremonial procession or secret nighttime movement, Harald was part of the Varangian wall shielding him from danger. His presence alone was a deterrent. Even the most ambitious conspirator thought twice before testing a guard, who looked as though he could break a man simply by leaning on him too hard. But guarding the emperor was not just about standing still looking intimidating, though Harald certainly excelled at that. The Varangians were the final line of defence against plots. They vetted rooms before the emperor entered them, monitored courtiers for suspicious behaviour, and intervened quietly when threats arose. Harald learned names, faces, allegiances. He developed an instinct for danger, spotting subtle signs, a glance too sharp, a hand too quick, that others missed. In a realm where poison was more common than open battle, vigilance was his greatest weapon. Michael IV, whose health often fluctuated, relied heavily on the stability and loyalty of his northern guardsmen. Some Byzantine chroniclers even hint that Harald's honesty was refreshing for an emperor drowning in court politics. The Norsemen had no ties to Byzantine noble families, no interest in palace intrigue, and no agenda beyond fulfilling his oath. For Harald, this was more than military service. It was an education in power, true power. He watched emperors command legions with a word, manage rebellions with a gesture, and hold entire provinces in the palm of their hand. One day he would attempt the same. But here in Constantinople, Harald was still sharpening the edge of a destiny that would one day shake kingdoms. The emperor had gained a guardian, and Harald had gained a blueprint for kingship. Few places in the medieval world carried the same mystique as the treasure vaults beneath Hagia Sophia. This was not an ordinary storeroom. It was the financial heart of the empire. A labyrinth of locked chambers containing gold seals, ceremonial crowns, imperial regalia, relics, diplomatic gifts from distant kings, and more coin than most kingdoms would see in an entire century. To guard it required more than strength. It required discipline, intelligence, and unwavering honesty. So naturally, the Byzantines gave the job to the Varangians. And naturally, the Varangian they trusted the most was Harald Hardrada. Harald's role as a vault guardian was a testament to his rising reputation. The empire did not give such responsibilities to men who were merely good with an axe. They gave them to men whom corruption could not touch, and Harald, with his stern northern honour and terrifying stare, fit that description perfectly. The sagas say he supervised the movement of treasure during ceremonies, oversaw its inventory, and ensured that nothing, not even a single gold coin, slipped into the wrong hands. This was dangerous work. Treasure was temptation, and temptation bred conspiracies. Courtiers schemed constantly, dreaming of buying power, influence, or even thrones. A missing artifact could spark an investigation. A missing chest of coins could topple a noble house. Harald stood in the centre of all this with quiet confidence, as impartial as stone. His duty was not simply to guard wealth. It was to protect the empire's stability. But there was another layer to this assignment: prestige. Only elite Varangians were allowed into the treasure vaults, and those who served there often became wealthy themselves, rewarded with bonuses, spoils, and a share of imperial gifts. Harald, already driven by ambition, did not waste the opportunity. Service in the vaults gave him access to wealth he could never have imagined back home. By the time he left Byzantium years later, he possessed enough gold to buy alliances, hire armies, and reclaim the throne he had lost as a teenager. The sagas whisper that he sometimes guarded relics brought from Jerusalem, treasures seized from rebellions, and diplomatic gifts from distant lands like Egypt or Persia. Standing in the flickering torchlight surrounded by centuries of accumulated brilliance, Harald observed firsthand how empires measured power not only by armies, but by treasure. Every chest he protected, every artifact he oversaw, forged his understanding of wealth as a tool of rule. Constantinople was shaping him, moulding the warrior into a leader. In the vaults beneath Hagia Sophia, Harald did not just guard gold. He learned how kings are made. If Harald Hardrada had only guarded emperors and treasure vaults, his legend would have been impressive. But it was in Sicily, that sun-soaked crossroads of the Mediterranean, where he truly earned the title the Norse sagas later gave him, the Thunderbolt of Byzantium. The island was a powder keg of revolt, ambition, and cultural rivalry. Greeks, Arabs, Lombards, and Norman adventurers all fought for influence. When rebellion broke out and local forces began slipping from imperial hands, the Byzantines knew exactly who to send: the Varangians, and among them, Harald, already infamous among rebels for appearing on battlefields like a sudden, unstoppable storm. The campaign in Sicily was brutal. The rebel fortresses were perched on cliffs, hidden in canyons, and protected by labyrinthine city walls. Siege warfare in the Mediterranean heat tested even seasoned veterans. But Harald thrived. While many soldiers wilted under the scorching sun, the tall Norwegian moved with a calm, relentless certainty that unnerved his opponents. He had the rare combination of endurance, discipline, and sheer stubborn willpower. A blend that made him almost alien to the rebels who faced him. One saga claims he devised a daring plan to burn ships in a fortified harbour, breaking the rebels' supply lines. Another says he scaled a cliffside under cover of night to open the gates of a besieged town. Byzantine sources, though less dramatic, agree that he was instrumental in capturing several key strongholds. Whether or not every story is literal truth, the pattern is consistent. Whenever a fortress fell, Harald's name was involved. He impressed not only the commanders but the rank-and-file soldiers who marched beside him. While Harald was ambitious, he was no aloof aristocrat. He fought in the shield wall, carried his own gear, and shared the hardships of the campaign. To the Byzantines, this humility, combined with terrifying combat ability, made him a warrior worthy of respect. To fellow Varangians, it made him a leader. Victories in Sicily strengthened the empire's grip on the island and flooded its coffers with spoils. And Harald, always strategic, took his share. These campaigns were not simply military achievements. They were investments in the future he was quietly planning. By the end of the Sicilian War, Harald was no longer just a promising young guardsman. He was a battlefield commander in all but name, a man whose presence turned the tide of war. The rebels had a nickname for him, the North Wind, because he swept down from nowhere and left destruction in his wake. But for Byzantium, he was something even more valuable, a thunderbolt they could unleash whenever the world caught fire. After Sicily, Harald had earned a reputation as the Varangian who did not break, did not bend, and, judging by how rebellions dissolved around him, apparently did not tire. So when the Byzantine Empire turned its attention eastward, to the ever-turbulent Holy Lands, and the wealthy Syrian cities threatened by upheaval, it was only natural that Harald was sent with the elite contingents. These campaigns were less talked about in Byzantine chronicles, but celebrated vividly in Norse sagas, which claim Harald travelled as far as Jerusalem and fought under the burning sun of the Levant. Whether every detail is literal or beautifully exaggerated, one thing is certain. Harald served in the East, and he distinguished himself once again. The conditions were a world apart from the misty forests of Norway or the marble corridors of Constantinople. Heat shimmered across desert plains, sandstorms swept over camps, and enemy forces, Arab warriors hardened by generations of conflict, fought with tactics unfamiliar to northern soldiers. But Harald adapted quickly. He learned how to march longer with less water, how to fight in looser formations suited to the open desert, and how to keep discipline in clashes where the terrain was often more dangerous than the enemy. The sagas paint him as a pilgrim warrior, stating that he visited Jerusalem and helped secure routes for Christian pilgrims. Some accounts claim he fought bandits near the Jordan River, or guarded caravans carrying imperial treasures to holy shrines. Byzantine historians note that Varangians participated in suppressing revolts in Antioch and helping reassert control over critical eastern provinces, campaigns Harald almost certainly took part in. One story claims he played a key role in capturing a fortress by tunnelling beneath its walls, collapsing the defences in one calculated strike. Another suggests he negotiated terms with local leaders after demonstrating such overwhelming force that they decided diplomacy was healthier than resistance. As always, sagas exaggerate, but they don't invent reputations out of thin air. Harald earned his. These campaigns brought him more than victories. They taught him political finesse, introduced him to the wealth of eastern markets, and exposed him to a variety of fighting styles that broadened his understanding of warfare. To Harald, every battle, every march, every negotiation was a lesson, one he would later apply when claiming a throne of his own. By the end of the eastern expeditions, Harald had become something remarkable, a warrior who could fight like a Viking, strategize like a Byzantine, negotiate like a Rus noble, and endure like a man carved from iron, a perfect storm preparing for destiny. By the time Harald Hardrada reached the end of his service in the Varangian Guard, he was no longer the teenage exile who had stumbled into Constantinople looking for purpose. He had become something far larger, a commander in all but name, a collector of fortunes, a veteran of rebellions, sieges, desert marches, sea campaigns, and palace intrigue. He was now a man who had guarded emperors, crushed uprisings, marched across continents, and earned nicknames whispered in both fear and admiration. The Thunderbolt of Byzantium. And yet, despite all he had achieved, Harald knew one truth. The empire was not his home. He had come to Byzantium to forge a future, not to remain a permanent servant of emperors. His ambition pointed northward, toward the cold fjords of Norway, where old wounds and unfinished business still called his name. But leaving Byzantium was not as simple as packing his armour and walking out the gates. The empire did not like losing valuable assets, especially one as formidable as Harald. Court factions were shifting again. Emperor Michael IV had passed, and new political currents threatened to entangle the Varangian star in dangerous intrigues. Some versions of the sagas claim Harald ran afoul of Empress Zoe's court, possibly over treasure disputes or romantic rumours. Byzantine sources are silent, but the tension feels plausible. Harald had seen enough to know when the wind was turning, and Harald still had something of immense importance to collect: his wealth. Years of campaigns had earned him fortunes in gold, silver, and gifts. Enough to make him not just wealthy, but powerful. Enough to return home not as a wandering exile, but as a contender for the throne. Gathering his riches silently and efficiently, Harald prepared his exit. The sagas describe his departure as dramatic, Harald and his men escaping by ship, slipping out of the empire with treasure the Byzantines might have preferred to keep inside their vaults. Whether it was theft, unpaid wages, or exaggeration, one thing is clear: Harald left with more wealth than any Norseman of his generation. When his ships finally sailed north, cutting through the waters of the Black Sea and then up the rivers of the Rus, Harald was no longer merely Harald Sigurdsson. He was a seasoned commander, a wealthy warlord, a warrior shaped by the greatest empire on earth, a man ready to challenge kings, and soon he would take the throne of Norway and carve his final chapter into history at Stamford Bridge. The Varangian years were over. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, was ready to rise. When Crusaders left Europe, they carried three things: a sword, a cross, and a vow of chastity that church officials insisted would keep them pure in purpose. It sounded noble during the blessing ceremonies, with incense drifting through stone cathedrals and choirs singing about holy duty. But the moment these knights reached the eastern Mediterranean, a land of warm nights, new cultures, and temptations they had never imagined, reality collided violently with theory. Most Crusaders were young men, some barely out of adolescence, who had marched thousands of miles through Italy, across Anatolian deserts, and into cities that felt more like stories from exotic tales than real places. Antioch, Jerusalem, Acre. These were bustling crossroads where Latin, Greek, Arab, Armenian, and Syrian cultures mixed. Markets overflowed with perfumes, silk, spices, jewelry, and people whose lives did not resemble anything the Crusaders had known in Europe. Loneliness was a powerful thing. Most knights had left wives behind, or had never married at all. Some came from rough rural villages where the most exotic sight was a travelling peddler. So when they suddenly found themselves surrounded by Eastern women wearing flowing linen, speaking unfamiliar languages, and carrying themselves with urban sophistication, it was only a matter of time before vows blurred, cracked, and quietly snapped. And the Church's expectations were uncompromising. Crusader clerics preached constantly about chastity, warning knights that engaging with local women was not just sinful, it was strategically dangerous. They claimed the devil worked through desire, and that a knight distracted by romance was a knight weakened in spirit. But soldiers living in cramped tents, marching in blistering heat, and risking death almost daily, tended not to think like theologians. They thought like humans, tired, lonely, and starved for comfort. Behind the rigid official rules grew an unofficial reality. Crusaders began forming private arrangements with local women, sometimes tender, sometimes purely practical. Some knights kept concubines who cooked, cleaned, and offered companionship. Others entered secret marriages without the Church's blessing, and some relationships bloomed from genuine affection, crossing cultural divides in ways that scandalized Latin clerics, but fascinated later chroniclers. What emerged was a double life, the public facade of holy warriors sworn to purity, and the hidden world of intimacy and scandal simmering in back rooms, gardens, and the quiet corners of Levantine cities. The crusade may have been about reclaiming holy territory, but for many knights, it also became an unexpected journey into the complexities of desire. A battlefield of hearts, no less dangerous than any siege. When Crusaders arrived in the Levant, they discovered a world where cultures overlapped like woven carpets. Armenian merchants, Greek artisans, Arab poets, Syrian nobles, Jewish scholars, and countless others who had lived side by side for centuries. Into this intricate tapestry marched the Western knights, armoured, sunburned, linguistically clueless, and absolutely unprepared for what awaited them, especially the women. To the Crusaders, Eastern women were unlike anything in Europe. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence shaped by ancient cities and complex civilizations. They wore light linen garments suited to the heat, adorned with jewellery far more delicate than anything found in France or England. Their manners were refined, their speech flowed with poetic cadence. Even the languages, Arabic, Armenian, Greek, Syriac, sounded to Crusader ears like music wrapped in mystery. And while medieval Europe insisted women remain veiled in modest submission, the Levant offered something different. Women in cities like Antioch and Jerusalem were legally empowered, economically active, and socially visible. They managed businesses, negotiated contracts, inherited property, and in some communities, they held more rights than many women in Latin Europe could imagine. For Crusaders raised in rigid feudal norms, this was equal parts fascinating and disorienting. Interactions began awkwardly at first. Knights who expected quiet obedience were often confronted with women who spoke their minds, haggled fiercely in markets, and treated Western warriors with a blend of curiosity and skepticism. Yet curiosity cut both ways. Eastern women, accustomed to merchants, scholars, and local soldiers, suddenly found their streets filled with towering, blonde-haired warriors from lands they had only heard about in rumours. The Crusaders' appearance, heavy armour, long swords, languages that sounded like growled thunderstorms, made them seem exotic, dangerous, and occasionally amusing. Cultural barriers didn't stop relationships, they simply made them more complicated. Latin knights often didn't share a language with the women they pursued, so gestures, gifts, and badly pronounced phrases became the tools of courtship. Some relied on interpreters, others relied on charm, or whatever passed for charm among men who spent most of their lives in armour. And yet, despite everything, connections formed, sometimes through genuine affection, sometimes through necessity, sometimes through mutual fascination between cultures that viewed one another as strange, alluring, or even forbidden. For many Crusaders, meeting the women of the East was the moment when the Holy War stopped being an abstract mission and became a deeply personal encounter with a world far richer and more complex than anything they had known. Their real education wasn't on the battlefield. It began in the marketplaces, gardens, and candle-lit rooms, where East and West first met eye to eye. For many Crusaders, the first step into forbidden territory began quietly. with a glance across a marketplace, a shared moment in a courtyard, or a conversation that lasted slightly too long in the shade of an olive tree. No banners unfurled, no trumpets announced it, but these small sparks often ignited into relationships that Latin priests would later call scandalous, immoral, or, in one dramatic case, evidence of the devil's whispering. But human hearts rarely obey sermons. Crusader vows were designed to keep knights focused on holy war, not romance. Yet vows are fragile things, especially under the Levantine sun. A lonely knight stationed far from home could find comfort in a smile, a shared joke, or the kindness of someone who saw beyond his armour. Many Eastern women, pragmatic and socially adept, recognized the emotional turbulence Crusaders carried. They offered hospitality, conversation, and companionship, gifts as powerful as any weapon. But these relationships weren't simple flirtations. They were dangerous. A Crusader caught with a local lover could face fines, penance, or open humiliation from the clergy. Priests preached that such liaisons threatened the purity of the crusade, insisting that desire weakened God's soldiers. Some knights were paraded before troops as examples, their armour removed, their shame displayed. Yet even public punishment didn't stop others from following the same path. And despite the church's fury, many Crusader commanders quietly looked the other way. They knew that men who faced starvation, disease, and siege warfare needed morale, and nothing eased the soul more effectively than a human connection. Some lords even encouraged relationships if it kept their troops stable and cooperative, but the real conflict arose in the hearts of the knights themselves. Many felt genuine love for the women they met. Others felt torn between duty and desire, unsure which path honoured God more, the strict vow or the kindness of the woman who shared food, shelter, and comfort when war became unbearable. In whispered corners of barracks, knights confessed their fears to one another. Could a holy warrior also be a lover? Could a man serve God in battle yet find solace in forbidden arms at night? The truth was messy, human, and undeniable. For every vow broken, a story began, of tenderness, betrayal, loyalty, or heartbreak, and each story revealed something deeper. Beneath the armour, Crusaders were not symbols of purity, but flesh and blood men, wrestling with the oldest temptation of all. Once Crusaders settled into life in the Levant, their relationships with Eastern women evolved beyond fleeting encounters. What began as secret flirtations often became structured arrangements the church refused to acknowledge, but everyone else fully understood. Local communities, especially in cosmopolitan cities like Antioch and Jerusalem, adapted quickly to the new Latin presence, and so emerged a system of concubinage and temporary marriages that blurred the lines between affection, convenience, and cultural negotiation. For Crusaders, concubinage offered stability. War was unpredictable, battles erupted with little warning, and disease lurked in every cramped encampment. Having a trusted companion, someone who could provide food, care, emotional support, and a sense of home, became invaluable. Many knights formed bonds with women who helped them survive the daily grind of Crusader life. These were not always relationships built on lust. Often they were partnerships forged in hardship, with genuine affection and interdependence growing over time. But concubinage had another dimension: practicality. Eastern societies, especially among Armenians and Syrians, had traditions of arranged temporary unions that allowed couples to be together without violating local customs. Crusaders, unfamiliar with these systems, often entered them without realizing just how official they were by local standards. A knight might think he had a discreet arrangement, only to discover later that her family considered him fully responsible, financially, socially, or even legally. Some discovered this at dramatically inconvenient moments, like when a battle horn sounded and their casual companion expected a formal goodbye or a promise of support. The Latin clergy hated these relationships with enthusiastic intensity. Priests lashed out in sermons, accusing knights of weakening the crusading spirit, corrupting their souls, and dishonoring the mission. But their moral outrage had little impact. Crusaders were men who had marched across continents, lost comrades, starved during sieges, and faced death repeatedly. A warm home, a sympathetic ear, or even a sense of belonging in an unfamiliar world felt far more immediate than theological warnings. Families of Eastern women also saw opportunity. A Crusader ally brought protection, wealth, and prestige. Some fathers arranged unions for political advantage, weaving their families into the new Latin power structure. Others hoped such connections would help protect their communities in chaotic times. The result was a complicated cultural ecosystem where romance, survival, negotiation, and scandal intertwined. A knight's concubine might be a lover, a caretaker, a political link, or all three at once. And slowly, these relationships reshaped the very identity of Crusader society in the East, creating unions no one had expected and the Church struggled desperately to control. As relationships between Crusaders and Eastern women became more common, something emerged that neither the Church nor the crusading commanders had prepared for. Children. These boys and girls, born to Latin fathers and Armenian, Syrian, Greek or Arab mothers, were the living proof of relationships everyone pretended didn't exist. And in a world defined by religious boundaries, noble bloodlines and rigid social structures, their existence created complications that were as political as they were personal. To Western clerics, such children were an embarrassment. Crusader vows were supposed to prevent this exact outcome. Yet there they were, little ones with golden hair and Levantine features, running between tents, playing in courtyards, or clinging to their mothers' veils while their fathers marched off to battle. Priests complained in letters back to Europe that Latin men have sown confusion among the peoples of the East, which is medieval church language for, they've been doing exactly what we told them not to. But for the Crusaders themselves, the situation was profoundly human. Many knights who formed long-term relationships with local women treated their children with real affection. These weren't secret offspring. In many cases, they were beloved members of new, blended households. A knight who lived for years in Antioch or Tripoli might find more comfort in his Levantine family than in the distant European world he had left behind. And for Eastern families, a child with a Latin father could be a symbol of alliance or protection. Such children often grew up bilingual, navigating both their mother's culture and the Latin customs introduced by their fathers. In some households, they were raised Christian. In others, they followed the mother's faith, creating a unique cultural fusion that blurred medieval boundaries in ways theologians hated but everyday life embraced. These children also shaped politics. Crusader states like the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa saw the rise of families with combined heritage. Local nobles married Latin commanders. Armenian princesses were wed to Crusader lords. Their children fused traditions, diplomacy, and identity. Some became translators, negotiators, or soldiers who understood both East and West better than either understood itself. Yet it wasn't always idyllic. When Crusaders died in battle or returned to Europe, many families were left vulnerable. Some women were protected by their communities. Others were forced back into hardship. The Church rarely recognized these unions, leaving mothers and children outside official Latin structures. Still, for a brief moment in medieval history, these families represented something remarkable, a quiet defiance of the rigid walls separating cultures. A reminder that even in the midst of holy war, humanity insisted on weaving itself together. Love created connections the crusade never intended. And children ensured those connections could never be undone. Not every relationship between Crusaders and Eastern women was born from passion or loneliness. Many were crafted deliberately, shaped by ambition, politics, or survival. In the fluid, unpredictable world of the Crusader states, marriage became more than a private bond. It was a weapon, a shield, and occasionally a diplomatic miracle. And these unions, controversial in Europe, were often celebrated in the East. When the Crusaders carved out new kingdoms, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, Jerusalem, they realized something quickly. They were vastly outnumbered. Latin Christians were a tiny minority ruling over Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Arabs, Maronites, Jacobites, and countless others. To survive, they needed alliances, and alliances required marriage. Suddenly, the knight who once swore chastity in a monastery found himself negotiating with noble families who saw him as a valuable political piece. Armenian nobles were particularly eager to build ties. Their daughters married Crusader lords, creating powerful hybrid families who blended Western feudalism with Eastern courtly tradition. These women brought dowries, local influence, and crucial knowledge of languages, customs, and regional politics. A Latin lord might arrive in Antioch as a foreigner, but after marrying an Armenian or Syrian noblewoman, he became anchored, socially, economically, and militarily. And for the women, these marriages could offer protection. Crusader armies were unpredictable forces. Aligning with a Latin lord brought security in turbulent times. Some Eastern families saw these unions as the golden bridge between old power and new authority. Others hoped their daughters could moderate Latin behaviour, a task at which some succeeded and many failed spectacularly, but scandal always lurked. The Latin Church frowned on marriages without proper approval, especially when the woman belonged to a different Christian tradition, or worse, another faith entirely. Priests complained bitterly that Eastern brides bewitched Crusaders away from Latin customs, which is medieval clerical language for "she has influence, we do not." Yet despite protests, many Crusader nobles openly adored their Eastern wives, praising their intelligence, loyalty, and political skill. Cultural fusion followed. Castles filled with a mixture of European and Levantine furniture. Meals blended Western bread with Eastern spices. Children were raised speaking multiple languages, trained to inherit thrones across hybrid kingdoms. The Crusader states began to look less like transplanted Europe and more like a new world shaped by interwoven identities. These marriages blurred the boundary between conqueror and local elite. They transformed knights into regional lords, foreign invaders into family men, and holy war into a series of unintended social revolutions. And in every union, scandal and opportunity walked hand in hand. If battlefield romances and practical unions caused quiet gossip among soldiers, then scandals among the Crusader nobility caused full-blown political earthquakes. In the courts of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Tripoli, love affairs didn't just spark whispers. They toppled alliances, ignited feuds, and occasionally dragged entire armies into conflict. Crusader courts were pressure cookers of ambition, fear, desire, and deeply fragile egos. Add the complexity of Eastern customs and Latin moral expectations, and suddenly a single romance could threaten an entire state. Take Antioch, a principality famous for its political chaos. There, Latin lords governed alongside Armenian, Greek, and Syrian nobles, all manoeuvring for relevance. A Latin knight caught with a local noblewoman wasn't simply breaking vows. He was interfering with delicate alliances. Families demanded compensation. Clerics demanded repentance. Commanders demanded an explanation for why their most promising officer was sneaking into a courtyard at night instead of preparing for the next military campaign. In some cases, the affairs became legendary. Chronicles record relationships between Crusader princes and widows of local rulers, between Western nobles and daughters of Eastern generals, and even between high-ranking Latin clergy and women they definitely should not have been visiting. These affairs often blended sincerity and political ambition. A noblewoman with deep local ties could elevate a Crusader lord's influence dramatically, but only if handled discreetly. When handled poorly, scandal followed like a curse. Jealousy was another force that shaped the Crusader world. Knights competed for prestige, and when romance entered the equation, competition turned volatile. Duels erupted, alliances fractured. Some commanders outright refused to work with rivals whose relationships threatened military unity. Even kings weren't immune. The royal court of Jerusalem occasionally looked more like a Byzantine drama than a holy kingdom. Eastern families also played a role. A Crusader affair with a noblewoman wasn't merely personal, it was political currency. Her relatives might support the union or condemn it, depending on how it served their fortunes. Some women embraced such relationships to secure protection or influence. Others found themselves trapped between Latin ambition and local honour codes, forced to navigate expectations no one had warned them about. Amid all this, the Latin clergy tried to impose control, but their influence often faded in the face of real human emotion. Love, desire, and ambition didn't obey sermons. They obeyed the logic of hearts under pressure, and hearts entangled in the politics of a fragile society. In this world, an affair wasn't just a scandal, it was a spark that could burn down a principality. As Crusader romances grew more common, from simple concubinage to political marriages and full-blown court scandals, the Latin Church realized it had a problem. A very human, very stubborn problem. The clergy had sailed east expecting to guide holy warriors towards salvation. Instead, they found themselves lecturing knights who were sharing homes, children, and sometimes entire lives with Eastern women. And nothing alarmed them more than the fact that these knights didn't seem sorry. The church responded with predictable fury. Councils were called in the Crusader states. Bishops thundered from pulpits, accusing knights of polluting the crusading spirit and entangling themselves in the snares of foreign women. Priests issued new rules forbidding unofficial unions, condemning marriages performed outside Latin rites, and demanding that crusaders abandon concubines immediately. The anger was so intense that some clerics lobbied for excommunication of any knight who continued such relationships. But reality made enforcement nearly impossible. Crusader armies were stretched thin. Garrison towns depended on local cooperation, and many commanders quietly believed that a soldier with a stable home, even an unofficial one, fought better than a lonely, angry, restless one. Why send a knight into battle miserable when he could march, knowing someone waited for him in the outskirts of Antioch or Jerusalem? So the clergy's crackdown created a strange dynamic. Public condemnation, private tolerance. Priests continued scolding. Knights continued visiting their lovers. Letters to Europe lamented moral collapse, while in the Levant, life simply carried on. The Church's attempts at enforcement sometimes backfired spectacularly. One bishop in the early 1100s ordered knights to dismiss their Eastern partners immediately. Instead, dozens of soldiers protested, threatening to abandon their garrisons entirely. Others flatly refused, insisting they would not cast out the women who kept them alive during sieges and sickness. The bishop, realizing he had nearly caused a mutiny, retreated faster than a man chased by cavalry. Eastern Christian communities also resisted clerical pressure. Armenian and Syriac churches recognized many of these unions informally, arguing that if the couple lived as husband and wife, then God surely saw the truth even if Latin priests chose not to. Over time, the clergy settled into a kind of uneasy resignation. They issued condemnations, but the relationships endured. And beneath the official disapproval, something remarkable happened. The Crusader states evolved a hybrid culture, one neither fully Western nor fully Eastern, shaped by bonds the Church struggled to classify. Love had created alliances stronger than sermons, and desire had reshaped a society meant to be purely holy. By the time decades had passed and the Crusader states settled into their precarious existence, a surprising truth had become undeniable. It wasn't just battles, castles, or treaties that shaped the Latin kingdoms in the East. It was relationships. The hidden romances, the forbidden unions, the political marriages, the blended families, all of them left marks deeper than any sword stroke. These bonds, dismissed by the Church as distractions or sins, turned out to be one of the most influential forces in Crusader society. Walk through the streets of 12th century Antioch or Jerusalem, and you would find a world nothing like medieval Europe. Markets filled with women wearing veils and men wearing chainmail. Children speaking Arabic and Old French in the same sentence. Houses decorated with a mix of Latin crosses and Eastern icons. Kitchens cooking stews spiced with cumin beside loaves of European bread. Even the architecture blended. European fortifications rising above neighbourhoods laid out in ancient Levantine patterns. This hybrid society didn't form because kings wrote brilliant policies. It formed because knights fell in love. Crusader families of mixed heritage became cultural bridges. They translated languages, mediated disputes, guided Western newcomers through Levantine customs, and forged diplomatic ties that armies could never achieve. A Latin noble with a Syrian or Armenian wife suddenly had access to networks of local nobles, merchants, clergy, and soldiers who would otherwise have remained distant. And the children, they became the beating heart of a new identity. These boys and girls grew up navigating multiple worlds. They learned Western chivalry and Eastern etiquette before they were old enough to hold a sword. Some became soldiers who understood the terrain better than any newcomer. Others became advisors who could read both the Bible and the Quran. A few rose to power, ruling over domains where their very existence symbolized cultural fusion. Of course, not all legacies were peaceful. Scandals left wounds. Some relationships collapsed when Crusaders returned to Europe, leaving families behind. Others sparked feuds or jealous rivalries that festered for years. Yet even those painful stories shaped the emotional landscape of the Latin East, a place forever suspended between love and conflict. In the end, the Crusader states were never purely European colonies, nor purely Eastern societies. They were something in between, forged not only by holy war, but by the quiet, complicated, undeniably human connections made in its shadow. Love defied vows, desire defied borders, and together they carved a world neither side could have predicted. A world born from scandal, but sustained by the hearts of those who lived there.